Hey folks, David Stewart here. I'd like to talk today about a very particular, very weaselly word, and that word is the word wealthy. That's right, wealthy. Now, if you haven't heard me talk about weasel words before, or you haven't heard someone else use the term weasel word, or you haven't read Way of the Weasel by Scott Adams, a book I do recommend, here's the short version. A weasel word is a word that you use to avoid having to use something specific, having to say something meaningful and specific. It's usually a word that obfuscates the meaning of a statement. And here's a great example. It is frequently the case that X, Y, and Z happens. The weasel word there is frequently, because frequently doesn't have any specific meaning. It has only a relative meaning. So you would rebut that by saying, well, there was only 41 cases of X, Y, and Z last year. And you would say, if you the person using the weasel word, you say, well, that to me qualifies as frequently. That's almost one per week. Frequent, right? Because again, frequent compared to what is the economist's answer. And so you could think of a million words that do this. Like often this is the case. People frequently choose this. Many people do that, right? Those are things that don't have a specific meaning. Something specific would be 20%, the majority, 150 people, right? Now, how wealthy relates to this is wealthy is very interesting to me, and I think should also be of interest to you who are studying rhetoric, not because it obfuscates the meaning of a statement it's placed into, but because the meaning of the word wealthy is already not clear in the minds of the subjects that are hearing whatever rhetoric is revolving around the word wealthy. The meaning is already obfuscated in the subject, which makes it very useful in this way. And that is that most people, and I know I'm using a little bit of a weasel word there by saying most, but I'll follow it up with like something a little bit more hard, even though it's an anecdote. Most people don't consider themselves members of wealthy, whatever the classification of wealthy is. Now, in all of my travels over my many years, not that many years, depending on how you look at it, but I've met a lot of people in my travels, a lot of different kinds of people, people with very, very extreme wealth. And of all those people, the only people I've met who basically admit to being wealthy, there's two people exactly. And I've known some people that are extremely rich and would never say that they were rich, but these two people were definitely admitting that they were rich and that they were wealthy. And it was basically because that label was essentially unavoidable for them. Either it was so obvious from the way that they walked around, or they wanted to be known as rich, or because they were publicly rich, like they were in the public sphere. People already knew them and knew that they were wealthy, so there's no avoiding any kind of good or bad stigma that comes to being wealthy. It's like, yes, I'm rich. That's two people out of thousands, right? So that says to me, most people don't consider themselves wealthy. And if you are sitting here thinking like, well, I'm not wealthy, I'll challenge that idea of your own perception of wealth in just a second here. But so when people hear the word wealthy, they automatically are thinking of some other group that's not them. That allows you to really sort of tickle a prejudice that otherwise wouldn't have been tickled. So when you're using political rhetoric and you say, the rich need to pay their fair share, almost everyone is going to think like, yeah, they should. Those darn rich should. They don't consider themselves to be part of rich, because at the very least, rich begins at like that next rung up the economic ladder. Which essentially means that you're blaming someone that isn't the person you're talking to. It's like, it's those other people's fault, the rich. And because this meaning isn't well understood in the minds of a large number of subjects, you can use it to essentially sort of manipulate their thoughts and thought patterns. You can use it to convince them that somebody else is the enemy when really you're going to be acting against that subject. And this was the case. I remember going way back to like 1991 with Bill Clinton being elected. He had all this rhetoric against the rich, and I remember talking to my dad about it at the time, and he goes, when Bill Clinton says rich, he means you and me. And I'm like, but we're not rich. And he goes, compared to what? Because my dad was an economist. He goes, compared to who? Right? He goes, we might be middle class really, but we're rich compared to other people. And when he implements a tax increase, and he did, he raised taxes massively, and it like really was a big deal for my family at the time, because like the usable income went down by like a certain percentage. It was like, I guess we're the rich. I never really thought of us as the rich before. But again, rich compared to who? Now, if you're sitting there and you're thinking like, well, I'm not wealthy. Well, Wealthy compared to what? Because if you took the poorest people in America, like most of the poor, and I'm going to exclude the homeless, but if I included the homeless, even they are better off than most of the people in the third world. But if you said, your average person that's far below the poverty line is on government assistance and things like that, they have color TVs, in some cases like flat screen TVs, cars. They live in well-maintained shelter often because of Section 8 housing and things like that. And they're well-fed. In fact, they're so well-fed that statistically they're obese, right? That's poverty in America. But that person who's poor in America, poor compared to the rich in America, is extremely rich compared to almost anyone in any third world country. So the poorest people in Europe and in North America are richer than the people who are just like normal people in other third world countries. They have more wealth, they have more stuff. Even then, because this word wealth is so sort of like amorphous in the minds of people. So anyway, you're probably wealthy if you're watching this. If you're watching this and you have internet access, you're wealthy. Hi, welcome to the rich dudes club. It's nice to have you. But another way to think about this too, at least in American rhetoric, is that most of the time they're talking about taxes, like we got to tax the crap out of the rich. And what are they always talking about? They're always talking about income taxes. And this sets up another bit of false belief where people are like, that guy makes $150,000 a year. He's rich. It's like, well, that's not wealth. That's income. Those are wages. Wealth is stuff. Wealth is the amount of things that you own. If a doctor's making $150,000 a year and he's spending $75,000 on that servicing the debt that he got, that he used to get his degrees, he's really not coming out too far ahead, considering how much he's paying in taxes and he has to live and those sorts of things. I know doctors that make, they make over $100,000 a year, and their take home, like their actual usable income, is the same as mine, if not less. They're living in an apartment to pay off a lot of debt. And that's just kind of the way it is if you choose to be a doctor. Like later on, once you pay off the debt, that income can turn into you buying more stuff and being wealthier. But real wealth would be, if you want to think about what wealth really is, if you want to compute your wealth, it's going to be the value of the assets you own against your liabilities, your debts, right? So if you're like, well, I own a house, it's like, well, if you're like, oh, I bought a $500,000 house and I made 10 payments. It's like, okay, you have a massive liability and a very, very small asset. Or you have a big asset and a big liability and a very, very small amount of equity that you've contributed to that. It's like you're not particularly wealthy. Whereas somebody who has their house paid off has a big asset there, or somebody who has a lot of stocks has a big asset. They are wealthy. And so the wealthy in America, it's like, it's like you hear this thing that's like, oh, Warren Buffett paid a lower percentage of taxes than his secretary. Well, Warren Buffett didn't get paid wages. He didn't get paid an income. He didn't pay income tax. He made all of his money on capital gains, and so he paid a capital gains tax, which might be a lower percentage than the income tax of his probably very well-paid secretary. His secretary probably earns a very decent wage, and that's great for her. She can then take the excess of her wages and invest them and then make capital gains on, make gains on that as well. So in America, and I think this is the case in most European countries as well, most Western countries, you have two different sort of tax systems. You have a what's called a capital tax system, and you have an income tax system. Income is taxable wages. Rich people don't pay themselves wages. They make all their money from their investments. That's how they got to be super rich. And the Beatles did this in the 60s with trying to avoid like an 80 or 90% income tax. they instead created a situation where they were investing their money, increasing the value of like Apple Records, I think, and then being able to pay capital gains tax on their profits with that. And I don't remember all the specifics of that. So if you remember them, please give me a comment down below. But the point was to avoid income taxes. So people get confused with income and wealth. They already don't know what it means. But the truth is that wealth is stuff, and most people who are watching this are in fact wealthy compared to the vast majority of human beings on Earth. And so the word wealthy is used basically because people don't know what it means, to sort of convince them that there's some other group that doesn't include them that they can then take money from, or is bad, or whatever has negative thing associated with it. And once you sort of break that down and you realize that any sort of definition of wealthy, quote wealthy, is going to be arbitrary by its design, because there's no point where it's like, if you have $150,000 in assets, you're not wealthy, but if you have $151,000 in assets, now you're wealthy. It's like, it doesn't, those two numbers are specific, but the word wealthy isn't. So it just allows you to say one thing and then do another later on if you're a politician, which is, of course, what every politician seems to do and has done for a very, very, very long time. So keep in mind that when you hear any sort of rhetoric about the word wealthy, that probably includes you. You're probably in the category of wealthy if somebody is trying to take money from the wealthy. And whenever somebody's talking about wealth in general, just keep in mind that you're far wealthier than the vast majority of human beings. And if you look at human beings throughout history, most of the people watching this are in fact wealthier than like the kings of yore, in terms of how much stuff they have and how cool that stuff is. So keep that in mind too, is that compared to what is a very, very important question. I hope this has been informative and fun. Leave me your comments and stuff down below. I do appreciate it always. And I hope you guys will have a great, great day.